The morning sun was just breaking through the clouds at John F. Kennedy Airport as David Johnson made his way through the bustling terminal. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had traveled this route countless times before. His carry-on bag rolled smoothly behind him, and his phone buzzed constantly with messages from his office. As the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country, mornings like this were just another part of his routine. David had built his company from the ground up over the past 15 years. What started as a small software firm in his garage had grown into a billion-dollar enterprise that employed over 10,000 people. Today's flight to Los Angeles wasn't just another business trip. He was heading to close one of the biggest deals in his company's history, a partnership that would expand their reach across the entire West Coast. At Gate 42, he checked his boarding pass one more time. First class, seat 2A, just as his assistant had booked it. David had earned his platinum status with the airline years ago, flying over 200,000 miles annually. The perks that came with it weren't just about comfort anymore, they were about the precious time he could save, the quiet space where he could work, and the respect that came with being a valued customer. The gate area was filling up with other passengers, a mix of business travelers in suits and families heading off on vacation. David found a seat near the window and pulled out his laptop. He had 3 important calls to make before boarding, including one with a potential client who was considering a $500 million contract with his company. As he worked, he noticed the usual pre-flight energy around him. Flight attendants were preparing for boarding, their crisp uniforms and professional smiles ready to welcome passengers aboard. David had always appreciated good service, having worked his way up from humble beginnings. He understood what it meant to work hard and treat people with respect. When the boarding announcement came, David gathered his things and joined the first-class line. His platinum card was ready, his boarding pass in hand. He had done this routine hundreds of times before, but as he approached the gate, something felt different. The flight attendant scanning boarding passes looked up at him with a puzzled expression. She was a woman in her 40s with short blonde hair and a name tag that read Jennifer. She stared at his boarding pass for what seemed like an unusually long time, then looked back at him with narrowed eyes. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice carrying a tone that immediately put David on alert. "I think there might be some confusion with your seat assignment." David smiled politely, the way he had learned to do in countless business meetings. "I don't think so. This is my boarding pass, seat 2A, first class." Jennifer called over another flight attendant, a tall man with graying hair who introduced himself as Robert. The two of them huddled together, whispering and glancing back at David. Other passengers in line were starting to notice the delay, some checking their watches impatiently. "Sir, we're going to need you to step aside for a moment," Robert said, his voice firm but not yet hostile. "There seems to be an issue with your reservation." David felt his stomach tighten. He had been in situations like this before, though, not often in recent years. As his company had grown and his success had become more visible, these encounters had become less frequent. But he recognized the signs, the suspicious looks, the assumption that something must be wrong, the immediate doubt about his right to be where he was. "What kind of issue?" David asked, keeping his voice steady. "I have my confirmation number, my ID, and I'm a platinum member with your airline." Jennifer took his boarding pass and studied it again, as if looking at it more closely would reveal some hidden truth. "This is a first-class ticket," she said, stating the obvious. "Yes, it is," David replied. "I fly first class regularly. You can check my frequent flyer status in your system." But instead of checking the computer system right there at the gate, Robert shook his head. "I'm afraid we're going to have to downgrade you to economy class. There's been some kind of mix-up with the seating chart." David felt the familiar surge of frustration that came with these situations. He had dealt with discrimination before, both subtle and overt, throughout his career. But he had hoped that his success, his status, his obvious ability to afford first-class travel would shield him from this kind of treatment. "I'd like you to check your computer system," David said calmly. "My reservation is confirmed and I've already paid for this seat. There's no mix-up on my end." By now, other first-class passengers were watching the interaction with growing interest. An elderly white couple stood behind David in line, their designer luggage and expensive watches making their status clear. Behind them, a businessman in an Italian suit tapped his foot impatiently. None of them were being questioned about their tickets. Jennifer finally walked over to the gate computer, but instead of typing in David's confirmation number, she seemed to be scrolling through other screens. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not seeing your reservation in first class. You're going to have to take a seat in economy." David pulled out his phone and opened his airline app. There it was, clear as day, his reservation, his seat assignment, his platinum status all displayed on the screen. He turned the phone toward Jennifer. "Here's my reservation in your own app," he said. "Everything is confirmed. I don't understand what the problem is." Robert glanced at the phone but barely seemed to look at it. "Those apps can be glitchy sometimes. We have to go by what's in our system here at the gate." Other passengers were starting to murmur now. David could hear fragments of conversations behind him. "What's taking so long?" someone whispered. "Why are they giving him such a hard time?" another voice asked. David realized he was at a crossroads. He could escalate this situation, demand to speak to a supervisor, insist on his rights as a paying customer and platinum member. He had every right to do so, but he also knew how these situations could spiral out of control. He had seen other travelers removed from planes, their reputations damaged, their travel plans ruined. "Can I speak to your supervisor?" David asked, trying one more reasonable approach. Jennifer and Robert exchanged a look. "The supervisor is busy with other passengers right now," Jennifer said. "Look, we're trying to help you here. We can get you on the flight in economy class, or you can try to book another flight for later today." The implied threat was clear. Take what we're offering, or risk losing your seat entirely. David looked around at the other passengers, some of whom were now openly staring at the confrontation. A few had their phones out, possibly recording the interaction. He thought about the meeting waiting for him in Los Angeles, the deal that could change his company's future, the employees counting on him to succeed. Missing this flight wasn't really an option, but accepting this treatment felt like betraying everything he had worked for, everything he had achieved. "I'll take the economy seat," David said finally, his voice quiet but clear. "But I want to make it very clear that this is not acceptable treatment for any passenger, regardless of their race or appearance." The word race hung in the air like a challenge. Jennifer's face flushed slightly, and Robert looked uncomfortable. But they had gotten what they wanted. David stepped aside and the line began moving again. As he walked toward the plane, David felt the eyes of other passengers on him. Some looked sympathetic. Others seemed confused by what they had witnessed. But what bothered him most was the feeling that this was just the beginning of a very long day. David made his way down the narrow aisle of the plane, his carry-on bag bumping slightly against the seats as he moved toward the back. The contrast between first class and economy hit him immediately. The seats were smaller, cramped together, with barely enough room for his long legs. The overhead bins were already filling up fast, and he had to squeeze his bag into a tight space 3 rows ahead of his assigned seat, seat 24B. A middle seat between a college student who was already asleep against the window and a businessman who looked annoyed at having to share the armrest. David settled in as best he could, his knees pressing against the seat in front of him. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a man who regularly flew in private jets for important business meetings, squeezed into a space that felt like it was designed for someone half his size. As more passengers boarded, David noticed something that made his stomach turn. The first-class cabin was filling up with passengers, but there were clearly empty seats. He could see at least 2 vacant spots from where he sat. The mix-up that Jennifer and Robert had mentioned was looking more and more like a deliberate lie. The businessman next to him noticed David's expensive watch and tailored suit. "Business trip?" he asked, making small talk as they waited for Ain. "Takeoff?" "Yeah," David replied, not really in the mood for conversation but not wanting to be rude. "Flying out to close a big deal in LA. Must be important if you're flying commercial," the man said with a chuckle. "Most executives I know in your line of work use private jets for the really big stuff." David almost smiled despite his frustration. If only this man knew just how big the deal actually was, but he wasn't about to explain his situation to a stranger. Instead, he pulled out his phone and opened his notes app. If he was going to be stuck in this seat for the next 5 hours, he might as well use the time productively. As the plane prepared for takeoff, David found himself thinking about the many flights he had taken over the years. He remembered his first business trip as a young entrepreneur, back when economy class was all he could afford. He had been so excited just to be on a plane, heading to his first big investor meeting. The stakes had felt enormous then, though. They were nothing compared to what he was dealing with now. That young man would have been grateful for any seat on the plane. But the successful CEO he had become knew that respect wasn't just about comfort. It was about dignity. It was about being treated fairly regardless of what he looked like. And what had happened at the gate wasn't about a seating mix-up. It was about assumptions, prejudice, and the kind of treatment that successful people of color still faced every day. About an hour into the flight, David's phone started buzzing with messages. His assistant was sending updates about the LA meeting. His CFO was asking about quarterly projections, and his marketing team needed approval on a new campaign. He tried to work on his laptop, but the cramped space made it nearly impossible to type comfortably. The college student next to him woke up and glanced over at David's screen. "Wow, is that your company?" he asked, reading the logo on David's presentation slides. David nodded, not wanting to get into details. "My brother works there," the student continued, his eyes widening. "He's always talking about how great the CEO is, says he really cares about his employees and gives everyone opportunities to grow." David felt a warmth spread through his chest, despite his frustration. This was why he did what he did, not for the recognition, but for the impact. His company employed thousands of people, many of whom had started in entry-level positions and worked their way up. He had built a culture where talent mattered more than background, where hard work was rewarded regardless of where someone came from. "That's nice to hear," David said simply. The flight attendant who had been serving drinks finally made it to their row. It was Robert, the same man who had forced David out of first class. When he saw David sitting there, his expression shifted slightly. There was a flicker of something. Maybe guilt, maybe surprise that David wasn't causing trouble. "Can I get you anything to drink?" Robert asked, his voice more polite than it had been at the gate. "Just water, please," David replied calmly. Robert poured the water. His hands shook slightly. David noticed but didn't comment. He accepted his drink with a quiet thank you and went back to his work. But Robert didn't move on immediately. He lingered by their row, clearly wanting to say something. Finally, he leaned down slightly. "I hope you understand, sir," he said, quietly, "that what happened earlier was just about the seating chart, nothing personal." David looked up at him, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "I understand exactly what happened," he said, his voice calm but firm. "The question is whether you do." Robert's face reddened and he quickly moved on to the next row. The businessman next to David raised an eyebrow. "What was that about?" he asked. David just shrugged. "Some people have a hard time believing that success comes in all colors," the businessman nodded knowingly. "I've seen it happen before. My company's VP is a black woman, brilliant as they come, Harvard MBA, but she still gets mistaken for an assistant sometimes when she walks into meetings." As the flight continued, David noticed other passengers becoming aware of his situation. Word was spreading quietly through the cabin. The college student next to him had texted his brother, who confirmed that David was indeed the CEO of the company. A woman across the aisle had recognized him from a business magazine article. Soon, people were discreetly glancing in his direction, some with sympathy, others with curiosity. A passenger from first class walked back to use the restroom and stopped when he saw David. It was the elderly man who had been standing behind him in the boarding line. "Excuse me," the man said quietly, "but weren't you supposed to be in first class? I saw what happened at the gate." David nodded. "Yes, I was, but they said there was a seating issue." The older man's face darkened with anger. "That's ridiculous. I could see empty seats when I boarded. This is completely unacceptable. He pulled out his phone and started typing furiously. I'm writing to the airline right now. This kind of treatment is disgraceful. David was touched by the man's outrage on his behalf, but he also knew that one complaint, even from a first-class passenger, wouldn't change much. Airlines dealt with complaints every day. They had form letters and customer service representatives trained to apologize without admitting fault. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, David's phone buzzed with a call from his assistant back in New York. "How was your flight?" she asked when he answered. David glanced around at the cramped economy cabin, at Robert, who was still avoiding eye contact, at the other passengers who now knew exactly who he was and what had happened to him. "Interesting," he said. "Very interesting." What his assistant didn't know, what none of the flight crew realized, was that David had spent the entire flight thinking, not just about the discrimination he had faced, but about power, about justice, about the responsibility that came with success. The airline had made a mistake today, a big one. They had humiliated the wrong person at the wrong time, in front of too many witnesses. And David was about to show them exactly what that mistake was going to cost them. As the plane touched down at Los Angeles International Airport, David felt his phone buzzing with an urgent call. The caller ID showed his chief operating officer's name, and David knew this had to be important. He answered quickly, keeping his voice low in the crowded cabin. "David, thank God you're here," came the excited voice on the other end. "The Peterson Group just agreed to our terms. The cloud infrastructure deal is moving forward faster than we expected. They want to sign the contracts tomorrow morning instead of next week." David's heart raced. The Peterson Group deal was worth $500 million over 3 years. It would be the largest contract in his company's history, opening doors to partnerships with Fortune 500 companies across the country. This was the kind of deal that could transform everything. "That's fantastic news," David said, trying to contain his excitement while passengers around him began gathering their belongings. "Have you sent the final proposals to all the potential partners?" "That's actually why I'm calling," his COO continued. 3 companies are still competing for the telecommunications partnership portion of the deal. The Peterson Group wants to make their final decision based on our recommendation. One of those companies is SkyWest Airlines. David nearly dropped his phone. SkyWest Airlines. The same airline whose flight attendants had just humiliated him, forced him out of first class, and treated him like he didn't belong. The irony hit him like a punch to the stomach. "Are you still there?" his COO asked. "Yeah, I'm here," David managed. "SkyWest Airlines, you said?" "Right. They've been pushing hard for this partnership. Their executives have been calling our office every day this week. They're offering some impressive terms for the corporate travel management portion of the Peterson contract. If we recommend them, they could be looking at contracts worth hundreds of millions over the next 5 years." David looked around the cabin as passengers slowly filed off the plane. He could see Robert and Jennifer near the front, chatting casually as they prepared for their next flight. They had no idea that the man they had discriminated against held their company's financial future in his hands. "I need you to send me all the partnership proposals," David said. "I want to review everything before tomorrow's meeting." As David finally made it off the plane, he found himself walking through the terminal with a completely different perspective. His phone continued buzzing with calls and messages. His legal team was finalizing contracts. His marketing director was preparing press releases. Wall Street analysts were already speculating about the impact this deal would have on his company's stock price. The college student who had been sitting next to him caught up as they walked toward baggage claim. "Hey, I just wanted to say thanks," the young man said. "My brother texted me back. He told me you're actually his CEO. He said you personally helped him get promoted last year when other companies wouldn't even interview him." David smiled genuinely, for the first time since boarding the plane. "What's your brother's name?" "Tommy Chen. He works in your software development department." "Tommy's a great kid," David said, remembering the young programmer who had impressed everyone with his innovative ideas. "He earned that promotion fair and square. He said you don't just talk about giving people opportunities. You actually do it." The student paused. What happened on this flight today was wrong, but I hope you know that not everyone sees the world the way those flight attendants do. As they parted ways, David felt a reminder of why his success mattered. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Tommy Chen and thousands of other employees who looked up to him. It was about proving that hard work and talent could overcome prejudice and discrimination. His phone rang again. This time it was his assistant calling with an update. "David, I've been getting some interesting calls," she said. "Apparently, some passengers from your flight have been posting on social media about what happened. A few people recorded videos of the incident at the gate." David felt his stomach tighten. He had hoped to handle this situation quietly, professionally. The last thing he wanted was to become the center of a media storm. "What kind of posts?" he asked. "Mostly supportive," his assistant replied. "People are outraged about how you were treated." One passenger wrote a detailed account of everything he witnessed. He's a retired journalist, and his post is getting shared everywhere. The hashtag #SkyWestShame is starting to trend. David found his driver waiting outside the terminal. As they headed toward his hotel, he scrolled through his social media feeds. The retired journalist's post was detailed and damning. He had captured not just what happened, but the broader context of discrimination that successful people of color faced every day. Other passengers had shared their own accounts. The elderly man from first class had written about his shock at witnessing such blatant unfair treatment. A businesswoman had posted about how she had watched David handle the situation with grace and dignity that the airline staff clearly didn't deserve. But it was a video posted by a teenager that really caught David's attention. The kid had recorded the entire interaction at the gate, capturing Jennifer and Robert's dismissive attitudes, their refusal to properly check David's reservation, and their obvious assumptions about who belonged in first class. The video already had over 50,000 views and hundreds of comments. People were tagging SkyWest Airlines, demanding explanations and apologies. Travel bloggers were sharing their own stories of discrimination. Business leaders were expressing their support for David and their disappointment in the airline. At his hotel, David sat down with his laptop and began reviewing the partnership proposals his team had sent. SkyWest Airlines had indeed submitted an impressive bid for the telecommunications portion of the Peterson Group deal. Their proposal was competitive, their terms were favorable, and their track record with corporate clients was solid. Under normal circumstances, David would have seriously considered recommending them. The partnership could have been worth $200 million to SkyWest over the contract period. It would have established them as a major player in corporate travel management and opened doors to similar deals with other Fortune 500 companies. But these weren't normal circumstances. David's phone buzzed with a text from Tommy Chen, the young programmer whose brother he had met on the plane. "Mr. Johnson, my brother told me what happened on your flight today. I just wanted you to know that everyone at the company is behind you. You've always treated us with respect and fairness. We're proud to work for someone who stands up for what's right." Similar messages were coming in from employees across the company. Word was spreading quickly through their internal networks. People were angry, supportive, and ready to stand with their CEO. David looked out his hotel window at the Los Angeles skyline. Tomorrow morning, he would sit down with the Peterson Group executives and make recommendations that would shape partnerships worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Companies were waiting to hear his decision. Stock prices would rise and fall based on his choices. He thought about Robert and Jennifer, probably finishing their shift and heading home, completely unaware of the storm that was building around their airline. They had seen a black man with a first-class ticket and assumed something must be wrong. They had treated him like he didn't belong, like his success couldn't possibly be real. Tomorrow they would learn exactly how real his success was, and exactly how much their assumptions were going to cost their company. David opened his laptop and began typing his recommendations for the Peterson Group partnership. As he worked, he smiled slightly. Sometimes justice came in the form of courtrooms and legal battles. Sometimes it came in the form of social media campaigns and public pressure. And sometimes it came in the form of a $500 million contract that would never, ever go to SkyWest Airlines. David woke up the next morning to his phone buzzing nonstop. Hundreds of notifications filled his screen. mentions on social media, news alerts, and missed calls from reporters. The story of his experience on SkyWest Airlines had exploded overnight. What started as a few passenger posts had turned into a national conversation about discrimination in the airline industry. His assistant called him before he even had a chance to get dressed. "David, you need to see the morning news," she said, her voice tense with excitement. "CNN, Fox Business, and MSNBC are all covering your story. The SkyWest Shame hashtag has over 2 million posts now." David turned on the television in his hotel room. There on the screen was footage from yesterday's flight, the video the teenager had recorded at the gate. The news anchor was discussing it with a panel of experts talking about corporate discrimination and the responsibilities of service industries. "This isn't just about one passenger's bad experience," said a civil rights attorney on the panel. "This is about systemic issues and how successful people of color are treated, even when they have every right to be in spaces where they've earned their place." David's phone rang again. This time it was his company's head of public relations. "Need to talk about how you want to handle the media requests," she said. "Everyone wants to interview you. The Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Bloomberg, they're all calling. But more importantly, SkyWest Airlines' stock dropped 12% in pre-market trading this morning." David sat down heavily in his hotel chair. 12%. For a major airline, that represented hundreds of millions in lost value. And the day hadn't even officially started yet. "There's more," his PR director continued. "Other companies are starting to distance themselves from SkyWest. 3 major corporations have already announced they're reviewing their corporate travel contracts with the airline. This is becoming much bigger than just your experience." As David got ready for his meeting with the Peterson Group, he couldn't help but think about the ripple effects of what had happened. Jennifer and Robert probably had no idea when they woke up this morning that their actions yesterday would be the lead story on national news. They had made a split-second decision based on their assumptions, and now it was affecting thousands of people. His driver arrived right on time, but instead of the quiet ride David had expected, his phone continued ringing throughout the trip to the Peterson Group offices. His legal team was fielding calls from SkyWest's lawyers. His marketing department was being contacted by journalists. His employees were sending messages of support from around the world. At a red light, David's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Usually he wouldn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Is this David Johnson?" came a nervous voice. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Kevin Mitchell. I'm a pilot for SkyWest Airlines. I just wanted to call and apologize for what happened to you yesterday. I wasn't on that flight, but I heard about it this morning, and I'm embarrassed for my company." David was surprised by the call. "I appreciate you reaching out." "I've been flying for SkyWest for 15 years, Kevin continued. "Most of us are good people who treat passengers with respect. What those flight attendants did doesn't represent who we are as a company, but I understand if you don't want to hear that right now." After the call ended, David felt a mix of emotions. He knew that not everyone at SkyWest was like Jennifer and Robert. There were thousands of employees who were probably good people, doing their jobs professionally every day. But leadership and company culture mattered, and yesterday's incident had revealed something troubling about how the airline trained its staff and handled situations like this. The Peterson Group meeting was held in a sleek conference room on the 40th floor of a downtown Los Angeles skyscraper. David walked in to find 5 executives waiting for him, along with his own team who had flown in that morning. The atmosphere was professional but charged with energy. Everyone knew they were about to finalize one of the biggest deals of the year. "Before we get started," said Patricia Williams, the Peterson Group's CEO, "I have to ask about what's been all over the news this morning. Are you okay? What happened to you yesterday was completely unacceptable." David nodded. "I'm fine. Thank you for asking. Unfortunately, these kinds of experiences aren't as rare as people might think. But let's focus on why we're here today." For the next 2 hours, they discussed the details of the $500 million contract. David's company would provide cloud infrastructure and software solutions for Peterson Group's operations across 12 states. It was complex, ambitious, and exactly the kind of partnership that would establish both companies as leaders in their industries. When they reached the section about telecommunications and corporate travel partnerships, David felt his pulse quicken. There were 3 companies competing for different aspects of the deal: 2 telecommunications firms and SkyWest Airlines for the corporate travel management portion. "We've reviewed all the proposals," said Peterson Group's CFO. "And honestly, SkyWest Airlines has submitted a very competitive bid. Their terms are excellent and their track record with corporate clients is solid. What's your recommendation?" David looked around the room. His own team was watching him carefully. They knew about yesterday's incident, but they also knew that business decisions should be based on merit, not personal feelings. The SkyWest proposal was genuinely good. Under normal circumstances, he probably would have recommended them. "Actually," David said carefully, "I'd like to suggest we consider other options for the travel management partnership." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "Is this related to your experience yesterday?" "Partly," David admitted. "But it's also about corporate values and how companies treat their customers. The Peterson Group has built its reputation on treating everyone with respect and professionalism. I'm not sure SkyWest Airlines shares those same values, at least not consistently." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Patricia nodded slowly. "You know what? You're absolutely right. Corporate partnerships aren't just about the numbers on paper. They're about working with companies that share your values." She turned to her CFO. "Let's go with the second choice airline for the travel management contract." Just like that, SkyWest Airlines lost a contract that would have been worth over $200 million to them over the next 5 years. David felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because actions had consequences. Sadness because so many good employees at SkyWest were going to be affected by the poor decisions of a few. As the meeting wrapped up and contracts were signed, David's phone buzzed with urgent messages. SkyWest Airlines' stock had dropped another 8%. The company had issued a public apology and announced they were conducting a full investigation into the incident. 3 executives had been placed on administrative leave pending the review. But the damage was spreading beyond just SkyWest. Other airlines were scrambling to review their own policies and training programs. The incident had sparked a broader conversation about discrimination in the travel industry, and no company wanted to be the next one in the headlines. Walking out of the Peterson Group building, David felt the weight of what had just happened. In less than 24 hours, a simple case of discrimination had cost one company hundreds of millions of dollars and changed the trajectory of multiple businesses. His phone rang one more time. It was his assistant with news that would make the situation even more complicated. "David," she said, "SkyWest's CEO is on the other line. He wants to speak with you personally." David stared at his phone for a long moment before telling his assistant to put the SkyWest CEO through. He found a quiet corner in the Peterson Group building lobby and took a deep breath. This conversation would determine how the rest of this situation played out. "Mr. Johnson, this is Richard Hayes, CEO of SkyWest Airlines," came a strained voice on the other end. "I want to personally apologize for what happened to you yesterday. What you experienced was completely unacceptable and does not represent our company values." David listened carefully to the tone. Richard sounded genuinely distressed, but David had been in business long enough to know the difference between real remorse and damage control. "I appreciate the call," David said simply. "I've already terminated the employment of both flight attendants involved," Richard continued quickly. "We're also implementing immediate company-wide retraining on customer service and anti-discrimination policies. We want to make this right." "Mr. Hayes," David said calmly, "firing 2 people doesn't solve a systemic problem. Your employees felt comfortable treating me that way because they believed there would be no consequences. That suggests this isn't the first time something like this has happened." There was silence on the other end of the line. David could almost hear Richard calculating the cost of this conversation. SkyWest's stock was in free fall. Major corporations were canceling contracts. The airline was bleeding money by the hour. "What can we do to fix this?" Richard finally asked. "We're prepared to offer you substantial compensation. First-class flights for life, a public apology, whatever it takes." David walked over to a window overlooking the busy Los Angeles streets below. Thousands of people were going about their daily lives, most of them unaware that a conversation happening 40 floors above them was reshaping an entire industry. "This isn't about compensation for me personally," David said. "This is about the message your company sends to every person of color who walks onto one of your planes. It's about the teenager who saves up for months to afford a first-class ticket for a special occasion, only to be told they don't belong there. It's about the successful professional who shouldn't have to prove their worth every time they travel." Richard was quiet again. When he spoke, his voice was different, less polished, more human. "You're right," he said. "And I'm ashamed that my company made you feel that way, but please give us a chance to do better. We want to learn from this." David appreciated the honesty in Richard's voice, but he also knew that real change required more than good intentions. "Here's what I'm going to do," David said. "I'm going to hold a press conference this afternoon. I'm going to tell the world exactly what happened, and I'm going to use this moment to start a conversation about discrimination in corporate America. Whether your company survives this crisis will depend on how seriously you take that conversation." After ending the call, David spent the next hour preparing for what would become one of the most important speeches of his career. His PR team had arranged for the press conference to be held at a hotel near the airport, the same airport where his ordeal had begun just 24 hours earlier. By 3 o'clock, the hotel ballroom was packed with reporters, cameras, and lights. David walked to the podium wearing the same suit he had worn on yesterday's flight, a deliberate choice that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. "Yesterday morning, I boarded a SkyWest Airlines flight as a paying first-class passenger and a platinum frequent flyer," he began. "By the time I landed in Los Angeles, I had been downgraded to economy class, humiliated in front of other passengers, and treated like I didn't belong in a seat I had rightfully purchased." The room was silent, except for the clicking of camera shutters. David continued, his voice steady and clear. "But this story isn't really about me. It's about the assumptions people make when they see a successful person of color. It's about the everyday discrimination that happens in boardrooms, restaurants, hotels, and yes, airplanes across this country. It's about the fact that success and achievement still aren't enough to protect you from prejudice." David paused, looking out at the sea of faces before him. Some reporters were taking notes furiously. Others were hanging on every word. "I've been fortunate in my career. I've built a company worth billions of dollars. I employ thousands of people. I have the resources and platform to fight back when I'm treated unfairly. But most people don't have those advantages. Most people who face this kind of discrimination have to swallow their anger, accept the injustice, and move on with their lives." A reporter in the front row raised her hand. "Mr. Johnson, SkyWest Airlines has lost over $300 million in market value since your story went public. Some people are saying the punishment doesn't fit the crime. What's your response to that?" David had expected this question. "The punishment fits the pattern," he said. "This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the visible tip of an invisible iceberg. SkyWest Airlines is experiencing consequences not just for what happened to me, but for every passenger they've mistreated, every assumption they've made, every time they've failed to treat their customers with basic human dignity." Another reporter stood up. "What do you want to see happen next?" "I want to see real change," David replied. "Not just at SkyWest, but across the entire industry. I want companies to look at their training programs, their hiring practices, their corporate cultures. I want them to ask themselves honestly whether they're creating environments where discrimination can flourish." As the press conference continued, David's phone buzzed with updates from his assistant. More companies were cutting ties with SkyWest. The airline's stock had now lost over 40% of its value. 3 congressional representatives had announced plans to investigate discrimination in the airline industry. But the most significant message came from Tommy Chen, the young programmer whose brother David had met on the plane. "Mr. Johnson," the text read, "watching your press conference made me proud to work for you. You didn't just seek revenge. You used your platform to make things better for everyone. That's real leadership." That evening, David sat in his hotel room watching the news coverage of his press conference. The story had become international news. Airlines around the world were scrambling to review their policies. Business schools were already planning to use the case as an example of how quickly corporate reputations could be destroyed. His phone rang one more time. It was Richard Hayes again. "I watched your press conference," Richard said. "You were right. About everything. We have a lot of work to do." "Yes, you do," David agreed. "I know we've lost your business and I understand why. But I want you to know that we're going to spend the next year completely overhauling our company culture. We're bringing in outside consultants, implementing new training programs, and creating accountability measures to make sure this never happens again." David listened as Richard outlined specific plans for change. It sounded comprehensive and genuine, but David had learned to judge companies by their actions, not their promises. "I hope you succeed," David said finally. "Not for your sake, but for the sake of every passenger who will fly with you in the future." 6 months later, David was invited to speak at a conference on corporate responsibility. In his speech, he talked about the importance of consequences, accountability, and the responsibility that comes with success. SkyWest Airlines had indeed made significant changes. They had hired a new chief diversity officer, implemented comprehensive anti-bias training, and created a passenger advocacy program. Their stock price had partially recovered, though they never regained the contracts they had lost. More importantly, the incident had sparked industry-wide changes. Airlines across the country had updated their training programs. Several companies had created new policies specifically addressing discrimination. The conversation David had started that day at the press conference was still continuing. After his speech, a young black woman approached him. She was wearing a pilot's uniform. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "I just wanted to thank you. I'm a new pilot with Delta Airlines, and during my orientation, they specifically talked about your experience and what we can all do to make sure every passenger feels respected and valued. You turned a terrible experience into something that's making the whole industry better." David smiled, thinking about how far they had all come since that day on the plane. Justice, he had learned, wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about using your voice, your platform, and your influence to create the change you wanted to see in the world. And sometimes that change was worth more than $500 million.